My sons cruelly taught me a lesson in family cruelty. I taught them one in adulthood. I let my two smug stepsons stand in the middle of the dining room and kick me out of the very restaurant I had spent the last 15 years of my life building. They had a cheap, overly aggressive real estate lawyer with them, a freshly printed eviction notice, and grins. So why do you think they just won the lottery? They told me I had 48 hours to clear my personal belongings out of the manager's office and hand over the keys to the historic downtown building. They claimed I was nothing but a glorified employee who had ridden their mother's coattails. And now that she was gone, it was time for the real family to take over the empire. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't throw a fit in front of the waitstaff or cause a scene that would end up on local social media. I just looked at Chase and Hunter, two overgrown boys in their late 20s wearing designer clothes, paid for by the sweat off my back, and I smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he knows something absolutely devastating that his enemies don't. I packed my laptop, took the framed photo of my late wife off my desk, handed them the brass keys, and walked out the front door into the warm Georgia air. Let them have the bricks and the mortar. They were about to learn a very hard, very expensive lesson about the difference between owning a building and owning a brand. To understand how two grown men could be so arrogantly blind, you have to understand the history of the copper skillet. When I met Caroline 15 years ago, she was a beautiful, exhausted woman trying to keep a failing diner afloat. She had inherited a gorgeous but crumbling historic building in the downtown arts district from her father. She had incredible recipes, a warm southern charm that could disarm a rattlesnake, and an absolute disaster of a balance sheet. She was 6 months behind on property taxes, her food costs were astronomical, and she was working herself into an early grave. I was a corporate operations manager looking for a change of pace. I fell in love with her first, and her cooking second. We became a team. Caroline was the heart, the soul, and the face of the operation. She commanded the kitchen like a symphony conductor. I was the brains behind the curtain. I completely overhauled the supply chain, negotiated aggressive vendor contracts, and executed a massive rebranding campaign. I was the one who designed the rustic, modern farmhouse aesthetic. I came up with the name, the Copper Skillet. I designed the logo, standardized her recipes into scalable formulas, and launched the marketing strategy that turned a struggling diner into a premier culinary destination with a 3-month waiting list for weekend reservations. But as brilliant as Caroline was in the kitchen, she had one massive blind spot. Her sons from her first marriage. Chase and Hunter were teenagers when we got married, and they instantly resented me. I was the guy trying to instill discipline. They preferred the silver spoon treatment. Caroline, driven by the lingering guilt of her divorce, gave them everything. They never bussed a single table. They never washed a single dish. They went to out-of-state private colleges on the restaurant's dime, graduated with useless degrees, and spent their 20s finding themselves while I was pulling 70-hour workweeks managing the staff and the books. The legal structure of our business was something Caroline and I had set up very carefully a decade ago on the advice of a sharp corporate attorney. Because the physical building had been in her family for generations, Caroline wanted to keep the deed solely in her name to eventually pass down to her boys. I completely respected that. It was her heritage. However, the actual business, the operating entity, the vendor contracts, and most importantly, the intellectual property, was a different story. To protect our personal assets from any potential restaurant liabilities, we created 2 separate companies. The first was an LLC that leased the building from Caroline and ran the day-to-day operations. The second was a holding company named CSIP Holdings. That company legally owned the trademarked name, the Copper Skillet, the registered logo, the proprietary spice blends, and the copyrighted menu designs. Because I was the one who had created and funded the branding and the intellectual property from the ground up, I was the 100% sole owner of CSIP Holdings. Caroline and I had a simple licensing agreement. The restaurant paid my holding company a token fee of $1 a year to use the name and recipes. It was a bulletproof corporate structure designed to protect our life's work. Chase and Hunter, having never worked a day in the corporate world, didn't know the difference between a deed and a trademark. When Caroline passed away from a fast-moving pancreatic cancer this past spring, it broke me. I spent months walking through a fog of grief, barely able to breathe, let alone run a restaurant. I kept the doors open because the staff relied on their paychecks, and because keeping the kitchen running felt like keeping a small piece of my wife alive. Chase and Hunter didn't grieve. They calculated. They waited exactly 3 weeks after the funeral before making their move. Caroline's will was read, and as expected, the physical building transferred directly into a trust for the 2 boys. That was all the ammunition they thought they needed. They walked into my office on a Tuesday morning, right before the lunch rush, flanked by their sleazy attorney. "We've reviewed the deed," Chase said, leaning over my desk with a smug, entitled grin. "The building is ours now. We're taking over the family business. We don't like how you're running things, and frankly, you're not family anymore. We've got investors lined up who want to franchise this place. And you're dead weight." "Caroline and I built this together," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low. "You boys don't know the first thing about restaurant management. You don't know the food costs. You don't know the suppliers. You don't know the staff." "We don't need to," Hunter chimed in, crossing his arms. "The place runs itself. People come for mom's food and the location. You just sit in here pushing paper. You have 48 hours to vacate our property. If you're not gone, we'll have the sheriff remove you for trespassing." Their lawyer slid the eviction notice across the desk. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at the 2 arrogant kids who had just casually tried to erase 15 years of my life and disrespect their mother's legacy for a quick cash grab. The fog of grief vanished. It was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp, diamond-hard clarity. "Okay," I said quietly, "if that's how you want to play it." "That's how it's being played," Chase sneered. I didn't wait 48 hours. I packed my things and left within the hour. The staff was confused and terrified, but I pulled the head chef and the general manager aside, quietly assuring them that everything would be fine and telling them to just keep their heads down. As I walked to my truck, Chase yelled out from the front porch, "Don't let the door hit you on the way out, and don't think you're getting a dime of the profits." I drove straight to my intellectual property attorney's office. The trap sprang on a Friday, right before the busiest weekend shift of the month. I sat in my home office, drinking coffee, and systematically dismantled their stolen empire. First, I logged into the operating LLC's banking portal. Because the boys had only inherited the real estate deed, they didn't have signatory rights to the operating accounts. I froze the corporate cards, shut down the payroll system, and transferred the operating capital to a new holding account. Next, I called our primary food distributors. I canceled the delivery trucks. Then, I called the specialty manufacturer who produced our proprietary barbecue rub and signature sauces, the ones I had legally trademarked. I instructed them to halt all shipments to the downtown address immediately. Finally, my lawyer dispatched a federal courier to the restaurant. At 4:00 p.m., an hour before the dinner rush, Chase and Hunter were served with a massive, legally ironclad cease and desist order. The document informed them that they were in direct violation of federal trademark laws. It explicitly revoked their right to use the name, the copper skillet, the logo, the menus, and every single proprietary recipe. If they sold a single plate of food using my intellectual property, or even answered the phone using the restaurant's name, they would be hit with an immediate federal lawsuit for intellectual property theft, with damages calculated at $10,000 per infraction. My phone started ringing at exactly 4:15 p.m. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again, and again. By the 5th call, I answered, putting the phone on speaker. "What the hell is this?" Chase was practically screaming, his voice echoing over the background noise of a chaotic kitchen. "You canceled the food orders? The bank accounts are frozen. And what is this lawsuit garbage? You can't do this. This is our restaurant." "Correction, Chase," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "It's your building. Congratulations on the real estate. But the restaurant, the brand, the recipes, the name that brings people in the door, that belongs to me. Check the Public Trademark Registry. CS. IP Holdings owns everything you're trying to sell tonight. You stole it from Mom. Hunter yelled into the background. I built it with your mom, I corrected him sharply. And we legally protected it so parasitic vultures couldn't dismantle our life's work. You evicted the only person who possessed the legal right to operate the business inside that building. So, take down the signs, throw away the menus, and I suggest you find a new name for whatever it is you're going to serve tonight. Because if you sell a single bowl of my shrimp and grits, I will sue you for everything you own. We have a dining room full of reservations in 45 minutes. Chase panicked. You can't just shut us down. The investors are coming this weekend. Sounds like a real estate problem, I replied. You boys wanted to be business owners. Time to put on your big boy pants and figure it out. Good luck. I hung up and blocked their numbers. The fallout was spectacular, public, and brutal. They couldn't use the name, so they literally had to tape over the expensive custom signage with garbage bags. They tried to open that weekend using a generic name, but without my proprietary spice blends and sauces, the food was a bland imitation. The head chef, realizing the boys had zero money to make payroll because they didn't control the operating LLC, walked out on Saturday night, taking half the kitchen staff with him. The customers who had booked weeks in advance were furious. They had come for the copper skillet experience, not whatever chaotic, flavorless mess Chase and Hunter were serving. By Sunday morning, the local Facebook groups and Yelp pages were flooded with one-star reviews. People were saying the legendary restaurant had been sold and ruined overnight. The investors they had bragged about took one look at the legally radioactive mess, the plummeting reviews, and the fact that the boys didn't actually own the brand they were trying to franchise, and immediately backed out. Without the revenue from a booming restaurant, the reality of owning a massive historic building set in. Commercial property taxes in the arts district were astronomical. The utilities to run a commercial HVAC system in an 80,000 square foot space were crippling. They tried to lease the building out to other restaurant groups. But commercial real estate is ruthless. Nobody wanted to pay premium rent for a location that had just publicly crashed and burned, especially without a turnkey business attached to it. 3 months later, I drove past the old building. The windows were papered over. A faded for sale sign hung limply from the wrought iron balcony. They were bleeding money, forced to heavily mortgage the property just to pay the taxes, watching their silver spoon inheritance slowly drain them dry. I didn't stop to gloat. I just kept driving. I had places to be. 2 miles across town, in a beautiful, newly leased space in an upscale retail plaza, the neon sign was being installed. The glowing copper lettering lit up the twilight sky perfectly. Inside, my loyal head chef was prepping the kitchen. The general manager was training the new wait staff. And the reservations were already fully booked for the next 2 months. They thought they could steal a legacy by stealing a building. They didn't realize that a legacy isn't made of bricks and wood. It's made of sweat, brilliance, and the legal foresight to read the fine print. The building is theirs, and it's rotting. But the copper skillet is mine, and the doors open tomorrow at 5.